The first sentence in your just released book, The Deep State Goes Viral, Pandemic Planning and the Pandemic Coup, is this. And I'm just going to read it, Debbie. For most of my adult life, I believed pretty much everything I read in the New York Times and heard on NPR. And I guess that was true until the pandemic, because when the pandemic hit, what is it now, like almost 5.5 years ago, for you, it must have been as if the rug had been pulled beneath your feet and you were dangling there in the air and crashing down. And for many people, that would have been, I don't know, maybe an experience that would have paralyzed them or depressed them. But for you, it kind of spiraled you into action and into driven by the desire to understand what the heck was going on and why all these weird things that were happening. And that desire to understand what was happening hasn't really left you in the last 5.5 years. Your life has completely changed, and you'll go into that, but you have done a lot of research that resulted in this book, trying to find the answers to your questions. And I'm just wondering whether today you believe anything that you read in the New York Times or hear on NPR.
I don't read the New York Times and I don't listen to NPR. So I think your description is exactly correct, Cornelia. And thank you so much for having me and for talking about the book. And so your description is exactly correct. The rug was pulled out from underneath me. So everything that I thought I could trust in terms of getting information, I couldn't trust. All of the institutions, the medical institutions, so medicine, science, academia, everyone, politicians, everyone was lying all the time.
And
so
you had
basically
been part of that because you were a medical writer, right? You did, at least at some point in your life.
Yeah. So for a long time, my career was medical writing, which means that I wrote copy for anyone who needed to explain scientific or medical stuff, either to physicians or to a lay audience. And so I wrote a lot of stuff for pharmaceutical companies. I also wrote stuff for government agencies. I wrote stuff for nonprofits. I worked as a freelancer. So I worked for a whole lot of different sectors. And so all I did was basically read scientific literature and kind of translate it for people or communicate certain things to certain groups of people, depending on what I was hired to do. And so I was very comfortable with scientific information and looking at scientific information. But then I did stop doing that. And for about 10 years before COVID, I just was doing visual art. I was doing photography and other kinds of printmaking and stuff like that. And so when COVID hit, I was not doing medical writing and I was not planning to do any kind of journalism or anything like that. I was planning to do visual arts, maybe write a novel someday. And so, as you said, when all the strange things started happening and I realized everybody was lying, I became curious, not just curious, but kind of insanely curious. Because as I like to say, I took COVID personally. And what I mean by that is that it disrupted, my children were both in college, it completely disrupted their lives. It disrupted the lives of so many people that I cared about. Now, of course, we are the laptop class, myself and my family. And so it was lovely. My kids came home from college. We were all home. We played games. My husband worked from home. And we didn't do any of the COVID stuff, and we didn't do any masking or distancing or anything. So we had people over all the time. We had dinner parties as much as possible to try to ignore what was going on. So in that sense, in our house, it was great. But the reason that I was going crazy is because I felt like the entire world was falling apart. And I took it personally because my kids' worlds were falling apart. And so I needed to find out who was doing this to my family, my kids, and all the other people that I knew and loved who were suffering because of all of the stuff that was going on. And my goal was to find out who's doing this to us. And that's all I've been doing, like you said, for the last 5 years. So for the first year and a half, I was not doing research. For the first year and a half, what I was doing was I was fighting on a local level mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. I was out fighting with the school district. I was writing letters to the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was fighting with all these arts institutions that I was involved with. I was fighting with the local grocery store. I was just fighting with everybody, as you can imagine, without a lot of great success. And extreme levels of frustration. My level of frustration was very, very high because not only was I not succeeding, but I also couldn't really talk to anybody about it except for my family. Everybody else was in my neighborhood and in my circles at the time was completely 100% brainwashed and propagandized and on board with all of the COVID stuff. And because of the political situation, because at the time it was the Trump 1.0, if ever I tried to say something like, oh, masks really don't work against viruses, and they never did. And before March 2020, everybody knew that. And I would try to, and I can show you studies, and I can show you medical textbooks, and I can, doctors have learned this in medical school for decades. And they would say to me, are you a Trumpist? And to me, that was probably the most shocking thing, is that I was approaching this from a purely factual, scientific, medical point of view, saying to them, look, I have evidence. Show me evidence to the contrary, and we can discuss it. Like, let's have a real discussion here about masking or about just any of the crazy mandates, any of the crazy measures. Like, you show me what your evidence is, and I'll show you mine, and let's have a real discussion. And they would just say, call me a Trumpist, or like it would be something political that had nothing to do with it. And so then I realized that everybody was really, really turned around. And then I also realized that there was the censorship and propaganda, which I never knew in my life to exist in this form, at this time in history. So I thought, okay, we had totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. We know what that means. We know what it's like when a totalitarian regime propagandizes the people and censors any opposition. That's not possible. That can't happen here. So when it happened here, that was probably the biggest shock. And that was one of the things that I started researching first, which was who was doing the propaganda and who was doing the censorship.
Right, right. So you started your research after what, a year or a year and a little, and then you did amazing research. And the end result of all the research that you did is your book. So in a nutshell, before we look into some of the rather disturbing details of what you uncovered, give me an overview of your book.
Okay. So
Oh, and also show the cover so that people see.
It's called The Deep State Goes Viral. I'm very proud of the title and of the cover art. The cover artist his name is Anthony Frida. And he is the same.
Bring it a little bit closer. Bring it a little bit closer. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And the artist is the same artist who did the cover art for C.J. Hopkins. I don't know if you know about C.J.
Yes.
Hopkins. He's being persecuted in Germany for the cover that Anthony did for him. So I said, I want a cover by the same artist.
Oh, that nice detail. I didn't know that. Yes, interesting. Yeah, right. Yeah. He was prosecuted and he was fined, I don't know, a couple of thousand euros.
No, he was, they said you can have a fine or a jail sentence. And he said, I'm not going to do either one. I'm going to appeal. So he had a trial. He was acquitted. Then he had an appeal. He was not acquitted. Now he's going to the Supreme Court. So I just want to shout out to CJ. Yeah. Yeah.
Good so, for him.
Yeah. So he's fighting. He's really fighting it. But the overview is, so first of all, I have to explain what the deep state goes viral means. I think that's pretty much the overview of the book. So the deep state, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misuse of that term. The deep state is not career bureaucrats. Career bureaucrats are the administrative state. So the people who do the administration, and everybody can argue or not argue about whether the administrative state is too big. I think we all agree that it is probably. But the administrative state is the people who are just doing the grunt work in the government offices every day and in the agencies. The deep state is not that at all. The deep state, and the definition of the deep state that was popularized sort of in the culture happened around 2014. This guy who was actually a government employee, and his name I think was Michael Lofgren. He wrote a book or an article about the deep state, and he talked about how the deep state is the military-industrial complex plus Wall Street plus Silicon Valley. So 3 giant entities that have enormous power and wealth, whose interests overlap and whose interests can support each other, all acting together in an extra constitutional space, meaning that they have no oversight, no accountability. Their budget is completely dark, and they can do whatever they want and be unaccountable to the law, unaccountable to the electorate, unaccountable to the people, and unaccountable to the politicians. So that definition is in the introduction to the book. And so when I say the deep state goes viral, what I mean is that those entities, and there's, a huge number of other kind of institutions and things that get sucked into the deep state. So all kinds of institutions that are doing work for the deep state, like consulting firms and academic institutions and scientific institutions. And goes viral is because with COVID, what happened was the deep state. So again, military industrial complex, financial and banking, and Silicon Valley, so tech all together, plus a whole bunch of other stuff that we can talk about. They went with a biodefense plan with COVID. And the biodefense plan with COVID was what we saw, what we experienced as citizens of the world between 2020 and I would say still ongoing now in 2025. And so the point of the book, and the reason why it's called The Deep State Goes Viral, is that COVID was not a public health event. COVID had nothing to do with public health. COVID was a national security, military intelligence operation on a global level by the global deep state. Now, the global deep state is exactly the same as what I just described, but on a global level. So it involves military and intelligence alliances like NATO, Five Eyes, EU. Those were all involved in COVID, and global pharmaceutical companies, global consulting companies, global banking industry, global tech industry. It's all global now. And then it's all coordinated through the global governing bodies, which is the UN, the WHO, the WEF, other places where, institutions that have chapters and offices everywhere. So it's very easy to disseminate and to coordinate through them. They're not the ones who are running it. They're the ones who are just, they have the infrastructure to coordinate a global response. And so that's the overview. And then the last thing that I'll say is that in the first 2 chapters of the book, what I do is I explain what happened, how it was a global biodefense response. And I call it the global public-private partnerships. That's the same as saying the global deep state. And I also have the second chapter says, what would have happened if it was not a deep state response? What if it was just a regular public health response? Because I think that's very confusing to people. People think, well, this is how we respond to viruses now. We lock down, we wear masks, we have vaccines, like that's normal. And that is completely not normal.
Yeah, yes, and I like that chapter. And I want, actually, that's the next thing I would like you to talk about, because I found that very helpful. Especially, maybe for younger people for whom, who might not know that this was extremely strange. But yeah, so with the military industrial complex, as you just outlined it, and then you said it's a gigantic public-private partnership, where the traditional definition of the separation, you have the state, you have the government on one side, and then you have all the non-government stuff on the other side, and there's a clear delineation that is completely erased. It's all
Exactly.
intertwined and intertangled somehow, and
That's
also
right.
not even just within one country, but through all these global institutions with all the other countries. So it's, as you said, as you referred to, as the deep global state, a public-private global partnership, something that I don't know if we have ever had that before to this extent. Probably not, because technically it wouldn't even have been possible in the past. So I also like the title because it's such a nice play on words. First of all, it goes viral. Well, it was a virus, right? So it goes viral. It goes also viral because it happens everywhere. It's like it goes viral everywhere where you
Thank
look.
you.
There are so many ways you can interpret it, and so that's fun. That's a fun title.
Thank you,
And
Cornelia. That's exactly what I intended.
yes,
Those two meanings, you just summarized it perfectly. They went viral with the virus, and they went viral because they were everywhere. That's right.
yes. And
Yeah.
another area that was really pulled into this, and probably way before all this happened, I think, is the media. And there's at least the mainstream media. I'm not talking about the independent media. I mean, voices like yours, for example, that became crucial for kind of like mental survival during these years. Okay, so let's talk about this chapter that you called. What did you call the chapter? COVID.
Chapter
I have
2
it
is
here. Yeah, tell me.
what would have happened if there had been no COVID coup.
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
what would have happened if it had been? What would have happened?
So throughout history, in the last 100 years before COVID, including, by the way, the Spanish flu, what happens when there's an outbreak of a disease that people don't recognize? So let's say you have some people in a village in China, they're getting sick with something. They go to the clinic, they get tested for the flu virus, and it comes back negative. And all the known flu viruses and all the known respiratory viruses come back negative. And so they have a respiratory disease of unknown origin. So that means maybe there's a new virus that's circulating. So they test it and they see what it is. And then they treat it with whatever treatments there are, maybe hydroxychloroquine, maybe ivermectin, maybe they get a secondary infection and they need some antibiotics. If there's like a huge outbreak, like lots of people are getting it and the hospital is overwhelmed, they might need to increase the hospital capacity in that area. They'll put out the information. They'll say, hey, we have this new outbreak here. This is what it looks like. This is what's happening. And then you'll see, if it's a respiratory virus, maybe it's going around and there's outbreaks in other places, and you treat those outbreaks the same way. This happened with every single novel disease outbreak ever in history. So Ebola, SARS, MERS, H1N1, like all the ones that you think are really, really bad. What happens is if it's really, really deadly, like Ebola, it's not very transmissible because you have to touch a person's body fluids in order to get sick. It's not like an airborne virus. And if it's not very transmissible, very deadly, then it's very easily contained. If it's very deadly, then you take the people who are really sick and you quarantine them, and you're very careful about touching them, and then you contain it and it's over. If it's very transmissible and not very deadly, that means it's just flying everywhere and everybody's getting sick. Then you don't really need to do anything at all unless people are very sick and need to go to the hospital. So with respiratory viruses, most of the time, flu-like viruses, most people are fine. They might have a bad fever. They might have 3 weeks of lying in bed if it's really, really bad, but then they recover. So you really don't need to do much except, warn the hospitals, maybe there's going to be a bad flu season. Maybe we need to increase bed capacity. And everybody else just lives their lives. And that's how it is always done. That is public health. So public health talks about how the whole public and everything that has to do with being a person in the world, which means your livelihood, your well-being, your sleep and your nutrition and your exercise, all of those things, we would like them to be maximized. And so when there's an outbreak of a disease, everybody should probably live their normal lives, keep, having an income and being able to support their family and go to school and play outside and do exercise, because that's what keeps you healthy. And so nobody would ever in a million years imagine that forbidding people from doing all that stuff would be a good public health measure. And so that's a norm. And then you tell people, wash your hands, stay home if you're sick. And then it passes. And that's a normal public health response. So what happened during COVID is every single thing in that response was turned upside down and backwards. So what they did was they said, this disease, this new novel disease, so we have some clusters of disease, let's say in Wuhan, China. Okay, a few people are dying from it. That's not good. But let's look for some good treatments. They actually did. The Chinese did a lot of looking for treatments. They found out that chloroquine, which is a relative of hydroxychloroquine, was effective, and some other things. And let's treat it with that. And then they started saying, so for a while, and I have a date, which is February 27th. There's a whole chapter in the book about February 27th, which is when they switched from public health messaging about the virus, which is what I just said. So don't worry, everything's fine. Oh, another part of public health is you absolutely positively do not cause panic. So you, as a public health official, your job is to keep everybody calm and to tell people it's okay. We know that there's this outbreak. We will tell you what the symptoms are. We are making sure that we have the treatments that we need. We're making sure that we have capacity that we need. And everybody just needs to calm down and not worry about it. And they were saying that before February, at the beginning of February. And, it got worse and worse through February. But on February 27th, they flipped a switch. And everything, all the media, all the public health people who the day before were saying you don't need to wear a mask, all of a sudden it was like, we must all wear masks. We must lock down. We don't know how long. It's going to be terrible. It's awful. And here's the reason. Because this is Deborah Birx famously wrote a book called, and I have a chapter in the book about this as well. It's called The Silent Invasion. This virus, unlike any other respiratory virus, it is a silent spreader. Now that's a lie, because every virus spreads, every respiratory virus or flu-like illness spreads throughout the population, and many, many people get it and don't even know they have it. Other people get it and they have mild flu symptoms. Other people get it and they have bad flu symptoms. And a few people who are old and sick die. And that's exactly what SARS-CoV-2 was. It was that kind of virus. It spreads through the whole population. It spread potentially maybe faster. I mean, let's say it was very fast spreading. But that means that by the time March 2020 came along, it had already spread everywhere. So anything that you tried to do to contain it was a complete waste of time. So locking down was a waste of time, masks, distancing, everything. It was anti-public health, and it was also anti-epidemiology, and it was anti-science. So that's why I was going crazy. But just to describe the situation. So they said, okay, it's spreading silently. That means that anybody could have it and not know it. Okay, if everybody in the world has a disease or a virus and they don't know it, that disease has a 0 fatality rate. Okay, so if everybody already has it or it's spreading silently and millions of people are getting it and they don't know, that means we don't need to do anything about it at all, because it is absolutely not dangerous at all. So they were saying things that didn't make any sense. So they were saying it's spreading silently, so it's very dangerous. Actually, if it's spreading silently, that means it is not dangerous at all. The other thing that they did that is anti-public health, that would never be done in a public health scenario, is in order to measure the severity of the outbreak of the disease, what you do is you see how many people are getting sick and hospitalized. You count those numbers and how many people are dying. That's what you count. They did not count those things. I mean, they counted them in certain ways, but they mostly counted cases A case in public health and in epidemiology is someone who's sick and needs treatment. They did not count cases of people who were sick and needed treatment. They counted people who had positive results on a PCR test.
Was
That is
that the
not a
first
public.
time? Was that the first time, Debbie?
Yeah.
I mean, they basically redefined what case means.
Yes, they did. They redefined what case means. In fact, I have there are emails showing when in early February, the CDC was saying, oh, the WHO just redefined the case, redefined what case means. And now a case of COVID is anyone who tests positive regardless of symptoms. So they consciously and intentionally did that. And then from that moment on, all they did was count positive test results. If the entire world of 8 billion people has a positive test result and nobody is sick or dies, then that disease is a meaningless disease, right? So positive test results are a meaningless metric, completely meaningless
You
in
know,
terms of public health.
it reminds me of the bird flu, you know, where you test these chickens and they are completely healthy and have no symptoms, but they test positive after I don't know how many cycles, and then they cull the entire, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of chickens.
Exactly. So they use the COVID model. So what happened was once they did that with COVID, they are now doing that with everything. And they're using that. And I just can't believe that people aren't aware of this and aren't speaking out about it. I don't understand. And this tells me that the whole public health apparatus, the whole medical apparatus, the whole academic apparatus is still completely captured by this deep state, right? They're still completely captured. They are run by the deep state. And so instead of saying, wait a minute, that is absurd to test animals who are healthy and then kill them for no reason, just like we did with COVID, we tested healthy people and then we locked them up for no reason. It's the same exact thing. Instead of saying that, they're like, oh yeah, that's what we need to do. We need to test everybody. And it doesn't matter if they have symptoms, and it doesn't matter if they're sick. It doesn't matter if they're contagious. Nothing matters. Except
Has
for
the Trump under the Trump administration has the definition of case been changed back to what it used to be?
Cornelia, the Trump administration is not any different from any other, from the
Yes,
Biden
right.
administration or the Trump 1.0 administration. Now,
So in other
that
words, no,
definition,
they haven't done that, right? It's still the
well,
same definition.
nobody's counting cases of COVID now. So I don't know what definition they're using now, but they are definitely using the definition that you said and that we both said for H1N1. So I don't know. I can't tell you officially because I don't have a document that says, yes, we did change it or no, we didn't change it. But the way that they are pursuing this H1N1 thing is exactly the same way that they did with COVID.
You know,
So I don't.
when they did that back then, was that announced to the public that they changed they must have announced it somewhere in some document, but was it picked up? Was there any kind? I mean, it certainly eluded me back then. I think I don't remember that or do I? I'm not sure. Maybe I did. Do you remember whether that was kind of
The change was a bureaucratic change, so they didn't announce the bureaucratic change. It was just a change that the WHO, CDC, and every other CDC in the world just adopted without. They didn't announce it or anything. They just adopted it
But it's so
as
crucial. It changes everything.
it changes everything. I knew it. I mean, I didn't know because I hadn't seen the documents, so I didn't know which date and which agency, and I didn't know the specifics, but I knew that they were using a definition that was absolutely nonsensical. So that was one of the things that made me crazy, because people kept talking about cases, and I would say, who cares about the cases? And they would look at me with that glazed, look of like, oh, we don't know what you're saying. We don't understand.
Yeah, because they
Because,
didn't know that the definition of case had changed. They were thinking about the old definition, probably.
well, no, they didn't know what case. It's not about thinking about the old definition. I mean, everybody knew that the cases were not people who were sick or dying.
Okay.
They just were, the propaganda machine convinced them that this was a case. A case is a positive test. So people were 100% propagandized. They couldn't think rationally. They couldn't be reasoned with. They still can't, many of them, unfortunately. So when I explain this to people, I mean, I know you realize that it's crazy, but I'm not sure that most people understand how crazy it is to count positive test results as a case in public health. It just is absolutely nonsensical. So that's only one of the nonsensical things that they did. They did so many nonsensical things. But that changed, like you said, that changed everything. And a story that's not in the book, but that's important, is that the PCR test um, was created and was validated and approved through a non-process by Christian Drosten, who is one of the biodefense cabal in Germany. He's a global biodefense guy.
He's
And
like the, he's like the German Fauci. He was on
yeah,
media all the time,
right.
constantly during COVID. He was the face. He was the big communicator. He was just lifted up. He was chosen, and he was like Fauci.
Yeah. But behind the scenes, he was also very much operating
Right.
with the cabal. And he was, so when he wrote the paper and got it supposedly peer reviewed about the PCR test in January 2020, it got peer reviewed and published in less than 24 hours. So that's not possible that it actually got peer reviewed or that anybody looked at anything. And the person who pointed that out, who was just a scientist, he got fired. He got completely discredited academically. His life was completely destroyed because he revealed that happened. And now he lives in a rainforest in Brazil.
Who
That's
is
just,
that?
I'm gonna remember his name. I'm sorry, I don't remember it at
Okay,
at
you
this
can
second.
you just tell me when you remember, and then
Okay.
I put it in.
Okay. Okay.
So all this what you're saying here is the cases keeping all this is to induce panic, and it succeeded. For many people at least, it succeeded. Hard to tell for how successful it was, but yeah, for a lot of people, I guess it did succeed. But this whole thing with pandemics for the last, I would say, at least for the last 25 years, so a quarter of a century now, there has been all this excitement and whipping up of fear of coming pandemics. Started, like, and when was it? Back in 2000 or 2001, the Dark Winter exercise about this coming pandemic, and then with with SARS-CoV-1 and swine flu, it was always, oh, pandemic is coming. A pandemic. It was like, I remember just saying, oh yeah, they're talking about the stupid pandemic again. The pandemic is coming. When I grew up as a kid or a young adult and later, I never ever remember that I was in the least worried about any pandemic or that people talked about it or that you had to be prepared for a pandemic. It was just not a thing. Didn't exist, wasn't there. But in the last 25 years, that really changed. And it was all done in a way as to induce panic, fear the next pandemic. First of all, it's going to come. We don't really know why, but it's probably going to come very soon. And you better be deadly afraid of it. What is this? What is going on there? What is this obsession with pandemics and what they call pandemic preparedness? A completely new expression as far as I know.
That's a really good question. Yeah. Before that, I'm going to just say the name of the guy. Simon Godek is his name. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Okay.
So he's the one who exposed the PCR and paid dearly for it. So yes, what is this pandemic preparedness thing? That's a great question. And that's pretty much in the first chapter of the book, I talk about the history of that, which is very interesting. So what happened was sort of simultaneously, two things happened. One thing was that the Soviet Union collapsed and there was no more communism that we could have a war against. So the military industrial complex in the West needed to have a different enemy. There was no more communist enemy. So instead of having a war against communism, we started having, as starting around 1990, a war on terror. And we started having a war on terrorism, and terrorism was a terrible thing. And that kind of started petering out. But then 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, it wasn't just a war on terrorism. After 9/11, if you recall, there were the anthrax attacks, which is when some people in Washington, some senators, some Congress people had anthrax mailed to them and a few people died. And that's when bioterror specifically became a very, very big focus. So before it was communism, it was terrorism. Now it was bioterrorism. Bioterrorism and biowarfare, those two things, is when you take a natural organism and either you just use it to try to kill your enemy, or you try to modify it to make it more deadly. That would be a bioweapon, and try to make it more deadly in order to kill your enemy.
Right, gain of function research.
That would be, yeah, that's what they say gain of function is defined as.
Well,
So
to put it nicely, it sounds so benign and wonderful. You gain some
okay,
function. Who can be against that, right? Isn't that
right.
nice?
So so what happened was this. So because biodefense started being this thing, and it's really scary, and also it's very lucrative because you can get lots of funding for researching pathogens and researching them in the wild, collecting them, trying to alter them, like with gain of function, and even more lucratively, you have countermeasures. Countermeasures are where it's at. Countermeasures are when you research the bioweapon, you also have to have a countermeasure. Either it's going to protect let's say it's in a warfare situation, you need to give your troops something that's going to immunize them so that when you spread it on the enemy, they don't get sick. Or if the enemy spreads it on you, you need something to counteract that. So that's the bioterror, biowarfare side of things. Because that was so lucrative, the very small, very uninteresting part of public health that used to be the pandemic preparedness part of public health. So it used to be before this whole bioterror thing happened. And that's why when we were kids, you and I never heard anything about pandemics or epidemics because they weren't even called that. That's not really a thing. It's just a disease outbreak. And if there's a disease outbreak in Africa or in Asia or in Mississippi, they handle it like we discussed, and we maybe hear about it. We maybe have to watch out to make sure it doesn't have an outbreak someplace else, but nobody really panics and nothing really happens, and a few people die, and that's it. But and there were plans. The government has always had plans for disease outbreaks. And those plans say it's just like planning for floods or planning for fires or earthquakes. It says like if it happens in a certain place, we're going to send help to that place. We're going to make sure that we get information about the disease from that place. We're going to have some funding for that, and we're going to track it to make sure it doesn't spread. And if it spreads, we're going to treat it as it occurs in different places at different times. So they had plans for that. And that was called pandemic preparedness. But now we have this whole other field that's extremely lucrative. That's called biodefense, where the government is going to give billions of dollars to researchers and to military industrial contractors to research and develop both bioweapons and countermeasures. Now, what's the overlap? So if you take something like EcoHealth Alliance, which people I think know, because EcoHealth Alliance is what people point the finger at. Oh, they're the ones who developed SARS-CoV-2. EcoHealth Alliance is like other non-governmental organizations that were supposedly in the field of pandemic preparedness. And what they said they were doing, and what they still say they're doing, and what the Trump administration still says they're doing, they're lying. They are collecting viruses from all over the world in order to study them. They're going to do gain of function in order to preempt nature. So we're going to pretend that we know how these viruses are going to evolve. We're going to try to make them more dangerous so that we know what might become the next pandemic agent. And then we're going to make countermeasures. Yeah. And the countermeasures are the biotech industrial complex. So that's the pharmaceutical companies, the academic institutions, the research institutions, the journals, the NGOs, which is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, which is the big British one. Those are all in the business. They're all in the business of saying that they're doing pandemic preparedness, when in fact, what they're doing is biodefense. So what they're actually doing is they're getting money from the military industrial complex to do biodefense research, billions of dollars. But the cover, the way that they justify their existence is to say, oh, we're researching these viruses because we want to make sure that we know what the next pandemic is going to be.
Right, which of course doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean,
no.
I don't know if that has ever convinced any person who, if you just think about it for a minute, it becomes crystal clear that this doesn't make any sense. And they used to call it dual use research, and then
Yes.
I guess they figured that this expression was giving too much away because it referred to dual use, and so bioweapon development and whatever this other thing is. So they called it gain of function research.
Yes, right, exactly. So that's what happened. So they merged. So what happens is they took the public health pandemic preparedness, which was nothing. I like to say it wasn't sexy at all. It was just like this little tiny field of public health. There were many other things. It was just something that you had a document in the drawer that said, if there's a disease outbreak, here's what we do. And they took that and they merged it with the biodefense part of it, and it became an enormous public-private partnership. Because the other thing that happened, during the time that they were afraid of the biodefense and biowarfare, like I said, because communism fell, also there was a huge growth in global capitalist systems. So like there wasn't anything standing in the way of global corporations, of oligarchs, people accumulating massive amounts of wealth and massive amounts of power and coming together. And it's not a conspiracy to say that they come together and they have shared interests and they have shared projects. And one of the projects is biodefense, biowarfare, which during COVID, they turned on the entire population of the entire world.
Right. And if I may, Debbie, with the fall of the Soviet Union, it also became apparent because George Bush was actually told by some of their scientists that they had a very well developed biodefense program running there. They had done all sorts of things and studied and all sorts of research. So when the Soviet Union imploded in the years after, well, the question was what is going to happen with that? It was very dangerous. What was, they had a lot of knowledge in the scientists, but they also had probably viruses and whatever they developed there. So I read that there were a couple of scientists visiting the United States shortly after, like in 1992 or so, to start kind of relations, and then several of them were taken on board. They actually came over to the United States and they started working for the United States to continue developing. And they brought over the knowledge. They might have brought over, God knows what they brought over, maybe all the stuff that they were working on. So that certainly also contributed to this renewed interest, I would think, in the
well, yeah,
development.
interestingly, well, yeah. It certainly, they did bring so just like after World War II, there's this thing called
exactly, like Operation Paperclip, right?
Paperclip,
yes,
where they brought the scientists, including biowarfare scientists from Germany.
Yep.
They brought them over. Now, very interestingly, Catalina Carrico, who is one of the developers, or so they say, she got the Nobel Prize for the mRNA platform that was used for the mRNA so-called vaccines. She was a biowarfare expert in the Secret Service in Hungary and in the Soviet bloc. So she was working on that very project in the Soviet bloc. And she was brought over, and there's a whole cover story about how she didn't get a job and she didn't know where to go. And then she ended up at Penn and ended up developing this thing. But interestingly, she actually worked with both BioNTech, which is BioNTech Pfizer, and Moderna. So we think of them as rivals. But she worked with both BioNTech and Moderna on developing mRNA. So that's an interesting sort of connection there with what we're talking about in terms of historically, and also in terms of what we're talking about the biodefense industrial complex. So Moderna and BioNTech, thinking of them as rivals is not necessarily, they're not exactly rivals. They're all in this together, and they're all getting billions and billions of dollars of government money. BioNTech was the German Moderna. So it's interesting that the same scientist who had been working on the Hungarian biowarfare program was now working with both of those companies. And now she has the Nobel Prize for creating extremely deadly and completely ineffective vaccines.
Debbie, I want to come back to what you said about the war on terror. So the switch to the war on terror. So we had 9/11, and then shortly after we had these anthrax attacks, just a few weeks later. And then just a few weeks later, we had the Patriot Act. And so the anthrax attacks, you can make a strong case that was an inside game. It has been proven that the anthrax strain came from Fort Detrick, this biodefense research lab that they have there. I think it was closed down now recently, if I'm not mistaken, but they could identify it because it was a military grade, very highly toxic strain of anthrax that didn't exist anywhere else. And the guy they had several guys, first one who had, and then another one who allegedly killed himself, and who knows if that's true, if he was killed or killed himself or suicidal, who knows. You can make a strong case that it wasn't that guy. But also with regard to 9/11, you're starting to wonder about this whole thing. So now, even people as venerable and established as Senator Ron Johnson openly question what happened at 9/11 with the Building 7 just imploding, and everybody knew, apparently, people were told it's going to come down, and it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, as do Towers 1 and 2. So we have this 9/11, a terror attack. We have the anthrax attacks, but we don't really know what's behind it. And we don't know who actually waged this, in whose interest it was to build up this terror. I just want to throw, I know our interview is not about this, but with all these interviews about Building 7 and what happened at 9/11 now being done, I think we should at least mention that.
I don't know, because I haven't done the research. So as you know, and as we were talking about, I think before we started the interview, I don't like to talk about things that I haven't researched.
Fair enough. That's
but
fine.
I can tell you that what I do think about 9/11 is that whenever something like that happens, there's always layers of who did it and whose interests it was serving. Did they let it happen? Were they planning it? Did it just happen and then they jumped on it and they were already ready with the Patriot Act, which was so many pages, there's no way they could have written it in time. So they obviously had it prepared.
Yes, good point.
So there's many things that you can question. And I leave it up to the people who are researching that. And I'm open to a lot of different theories about that. The one thing that we do know is that after 9/11, we started living in a situation that became increasingly what I would call extra constitutional. So just like the deep state operates in an extra constitutional legal space, what they did was they kind of transitioned the whole society into an extra constitutional legal space. And what that means is that when you're in a state of emergency, which now we're in like 47 of them, and by the way, Trump has declared more states of emergency than any president in the history of the country. When you're in a state of emergency, that precludes judicial review, and it precludes states' rights, and it precludes individual rights and freedoms and constitutional rights. And so the more states of emergency that we're in, the less rights we have and the less legal recourse we have to protect our own individual rights and our states' rights and stuff like that. And so starting with 9/11, the shift started happening. With COVID, the shift just massively shifted into a completely the Constitution didn't really apply at all. And I think they're really trying to continue that as much as possible with all of Trump's declarations of emergencies, and also with some interesting things that they tried to pass in the budget recently. So
yes, yeah, but Debbie, that's a very good point with this extra, what did you call it? Extra constitutional framework, because so we had the Patriot Act that was passed so quickly, just like, I don't know, several weeks or a month or 2 months,
several
or so
weeks,
after, or maybe even just a month after 9/11. So the PrEP Act, came later. The PrEP Act came in 2005. Before the PrEP Act in 2004 came the BioShields Act. And also, very important, I think, in the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization came in 2004. It had not existed before. So all these important pieces that you go over in your book were put in place like 15 years, 16 years, 19 years before it happened, but they were already there. Together with all this talk about, with all this gain of function research, or creating dangerous viruses as a bioweapon, with that going on, and all this pandemic preparedness craziness and hype going on at the same time. So you see this case over the last 20 years, 25 years of this building up to what then in 2020 emerged as the COVID-19 pandemic.
That's exactly right. And I just wanted to say one more thing about the last 20 years in terms of actual pandemics. So some excellent work has been done by a group called REPARE, REPPARE, which is a University of Leeds and Brownstone Institute joint effort. And what they did was they just looked at all of the, so-called epidemics and pandemics. I'm just going to call them novel disease outbreaks in the last 20 years, or in the 20 years before COVID. And what they found was that MERS, SARS, Ebola, H1N1, all the ones that we hear about, and Zika that we're all worried about, and we think those are terrible, in 20 years before COVID. Oh, and we also are told all the time, and I really hope that listeners pay attention, because we're told all the time that like you said, the frequency of pandemics is going to increase. The danger of pandemics is increasing because why? Because we're traveling more, or we have more interaction with nature, we're encroaching on habitats. All of that is also nonsense, because the more you expose yourself to other people, to nature, to viruses, the more immunity you have. So that is a nonsensical statement, just like the cases, to say that we are at an increased risk for disease outbreaks. We're actually at a much lower risk if we're exposed to everything all the time, if we travel all the time. And it's like when Europeans came to North America and brought viruses that the North American population had never been exposed to, that killed half the population. We don't have that situation anymore. So actually, we're at a much lower risk. And indeed, what REPARE showed is that with all of these novel disease outbreaks that everybody's all worried about, in the entire world of 8 billion people, 10,000 people a year on average, some years were zero, some years were like 100,000, but on average, 10,000 people a year died from those so-called epidemics and pandemics. 10,000 people out of 8 billion is zero. It's essentially zero. So the risk of dying from one of those outbreaks was zero before COVID. And during COVID, they made it seem like it was much higher for COVID, but also for COVID, the risk of death was very, very low. For most people, it was close to zero. And for people who are very old and sick, just like with any virus, if you're old and sick, a virus can kill you. And it could kill you if you were old and sick and you got whatever SARS-CoV-2 was. But no more danger than anything else. Even the flu, even in a bad flu season, it kills a few tens of thousands of people, which is sad. We don't want people to die, but people die of all kinds of stuff. And 10,000 people, let's say in the United States, 50,000 people a year in a bad year die of the flu out of 330 million. Your risk of dying of the flu is close to zero.
Right. So what I would like to do now is I would like to jump into one particular chapter in your book that for me was the most interesting one. And that is your chapter COVID mRNA vaccines require no safety oversight. So I thought it was so fascinating to read about this, because you go really all the way down to the wire to find out how they made it possible, how it was possible that these mRNA shots were unleashed on Americans without any safety oversight. And of course, lying about it, telling people all the time how safe and how effective it was, which was a complete lie. So, and all this stuff is still in place. So the same thing could be pulled off at any time. And this information, I think, is still not known. There's hardly anybody who knows it. And even when people just read the first 30 pages in your book, they're not going to know it. So that's why I want to talk about this, because you're probably not going to, and to make it easier, I'm going to share my screen so that we can, because it's kind of intricate, but really interesting. I think it's fascinating. And I hope it comes across as that, how this was done and how devious it is, how perfidious, and also how they lied about the whole thing. So I'm going to share the Kindle copy of your book so that we have the text, that there's some nice charts, etc. we can look at to make it easier understandable for people who watch this.
And I just want to also say you set it up very nicely when you were talking about the extra constitutional laws that were passed, the PrEP Act and the EUA in 2004 and 2005, because that's exactly where we're going now with this. So with that whole panic and with that whole upsurge in interest in biowarfare, in biodefense, and pandemic preparedness in the early 2000s, that's when they put the legal framework in place that Cornelia and I are going to discuss right now.
Exactly. So, so there are three parts to this. It's the PrEP Act, then something that is called OTAs, and we're going to go into that, Other Transaction Authority, and then the EUA that people are familiar with as an acronym, but not really familiar with what's actually behind it and what it means. And I didn't know that. I mean, I never really bothered to go into that. But it takes time. I don't know how long it took you for you to dig all this up. It's not so easily. You don't just spend 5 minutes on it. So it's a lot of research that went into this for sure. So these are the three parts, and I suggest we don't talk too much about the PrEP Act, because you and I together, we did 2 interviews together with you and Sasha Latipova, and we talked about the PrEP Act extensively. So for anyone who is interested particularly in the PrEP Act, can go and listen to these videos, and also to my video with James Roguski, who is trying to repeal, who is having a big project to repeal the PrEP Act. Okay, so let's start. Just tell me in one sentence what the PrEP Act does, and then we'll leave that behind and go to the OTAs and EUAs, because there's a lot there to talk about.
Okay, so the PrEP Act just gives legal immunity to anyone who does anything with countermeasures to whatever is declared to be a public health emergency under the PrEP Act. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services says there is a public health emergency, or a risk of a public health emergency, or a potential risk of a public health emergency due to X. And now whatever countermeasures we use against X are covered by the PrEP Act. So anyone who manufactures, distributes, administers, advertises, touches, is not going to be able to be sued for anything related to that countermeasure to X. And in this case, X was COVID.
Exactly. And I just want to emphasize, it can't just be a potential risk.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be, it can be just a potential risk. Now, potential risk, aren't there always everywhere potential risks? All right, so let's start with the OTA. So the military bought these mRNA shots from Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, hundreds of millions of those shots for use on civilians, and of course also for use on the military, but I mean mostly on civilians. Why the military? Why were they not purchased by the HHS or the CDC, one of the federal health agencies?
So before we even get into OTA, I'm just going to describe what OTA and EUA apply to 2 parts of the regulatory framework that is supposed to make medical products safe for the public. So what we do as a country and as a sort of legal framework in the regulatory agencies of our government is we say, okay, let's say a pharmaceutical company wants to develop and manufacture and distribute a new medical product. We want to make sure that that medical product is safe, that it's not going to kill or hurt anyone, and that it's going to do what the company says it's going to do. And so we have two things that we need to regulate. We need to regulate the development of the drug. So it needs to be tested in clinical trials that follow certain guidelines and certain rules and certain, the way that they treat their human subjects has to be regulated. And it has to be done in a way that can actually substantiate the claims of the company. So that's the development. So that would be the FDA regulating and saying this drug is indeed, based on the clinical trials that this company did, those trials showed that it's safe and effective. Now, once they do that, they have to manufacture it. And we also we don't want them to just be able to manufacture it in some dump, a dirty, unregulated, unsupervised place and just dump it into boxes and ship it. We want to know that every dose of that thing contains the same thing as every other dose, that it's pure, it's not adulterated, that it's manufactured in facilities that are sterile, that are clean, that there's not any kind of a contamination in the product. And that when they say we're getting a certain amount of a certain medicine, we're getting that amount and not something else. So that's the manufacturing side. So we have two different streams of regulation to make sure that our medical products are safe. One is the development, which is the FDA, and that's the EUA is what gets around that. And the other one is good manufacturing practices. We have regulations for good manufacturing practices, and OTA gets around that. So I just want to make it clear that these two ways that we have to make sure that the pharmaceutical products that we get are both safe and effective in terms of what they do, and also safe in terms of how they're manufactured. Both of those streams were completely subverted during COVID by OTA and EUA. OTA subverts good manufacturing practices. So all of the regulations that say we are going to inspect your facility, we're going to inspect the vials to make sure that what's in them is what you say is in them. We're going to make sure that each batch is the same as every other batch. All of those things are normal. That's what you do when you do good manufacturing practices. All of that was subverted because they used OTA. Now, OTA is Other Transaction Authority. Okay. And Other Transaction Authority is a military acquisition path, period. And you might be showing the chart where there's a few other agencies that are not military that are allowed to use OTA.
Yeah,
but
I'm
only
going to do that a little bit later because I wanted to.
Okay.
I started sharing my screen because I wanted to point out this one sentence here because I thought this is a really crucial sentence here. In a July 2021 document that you've dug up, it's a report to congressional committees. You found this sentence here, which is absolutely crucial. COVID-19 contracting. The Department of Health and Human Services partnered with the Department of Defense to leverage DoD's OTA authorities, which HHS lacked. So,
right.
Translate. What does that mean? Translate that.
Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, that's the sentence that I found. I think that a lot of Sasha Latipova and Catherine Watt had done enormous amounts of research on this, and I have to give them a lot of credit. And then I've kind of found this, which tied everything together, because this shows that the authority that the Department of Defense has to contract for certain things that the military needs, and all of the things under OTA are things that are supposed to increase the efficiency and the performance of the military. That's what OTA is. It has nothing to do with anything civilian, certainly nothing to do with public health. And so, like I said, OTA, which is Other Transaction Authority, which is a military purchasing authority and a military acquisition authority, it gives the Department of Defense certain abilities to get things without going through what they call it is in all of the documents and when they discuss it, without a lot of red tape. So the military needs stuff. They don't want a lot of regulation to bother them when they get their tanks or when they get their tech, when they get their computer systems, when they get their AI. They don't want a lot of regulations, so they're going to use OTA, which means a lot of regulations aren't going to apply. They're just going to get it really fast. So,
Debbie, when were these OTAs originally introduced? Do you know?
So I have it in the chapter. So OTA as a thing originated decades ago. So for several decades, OTA was used by the military exclusively to purchase military equipment. That's what it was for.
Do you know how far back it goes? I mean, was it like in the 70s or in the 90s?
No, I forget. I forget when it first was introduced. But I do know that at about around the same time as EUA and the PrEP Act, they introduced another aspect of OTA, which had to do with biological agents. And they said now the DoD can also use OTA in order to get things that might be bioweapons. But the only way that they can do that is if they get and then they can try to do countermeasures, right? It's all about the countermeasures. But they need to do prototypes, and they can get an OTA for a prototype. A prototype is just something that shows that it works. So like you make a prototype of a machine, you see, look, this machine works, and then you go and you do a whole full manufacturing run for that thing. And so the DoD gave itself OTA authorities, and we have to say that within the Department of Defense and also within Health and Human Services, over the years, again, starting in 2001, 2005, they started to insert all kinds of agencies in the public health realm that were actually biodefense. So DARPA and ASPR are two agencies that are supposedly working within public health, but they're actually just working on biodefense, biowarfare, bioterrorism. And so they gave HHS some authority to use OTA because they were using it in these little agencies that were actually biodefense agencies.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if you have the chart. I don't know if you have the chart.
Yeah. Let's go to the chart. And also, I just want to comment on the strange name, Other Transaction Authority, or in Other Transaction Agreement. I guess it can mean one or the other.
Yeah.
The expression Other Transaction is, I think it's extremely weird. So they have, it's so vague. It's so like other. It's just other. It's an other transaction. So there are all sorts of legally defined transactions. And then there is something that is completely amorphous. It's an other transaction. I mean, how do you even come up with a name like that?
And in fact, they say even in their documents that it is a non-contract. It is not a contract. It's other than contract.
So what is it if it's not a contract?
Right. What is it if it's not a contract? It's an agreement.
It's another transaction. So that whole thing is extremely strange. This is just showing what you just said, that this OTA, it is not intended, nor has it ever been used before COVID, for anything intended primarily for civilian use. Never before. So there is the chart.
So this chart looks very boring, but what this chart does is it shows you who has OTA authority. So who can use these other than contract, bypassing red tape types of agreements, other than the Department of Defense? Who can use them other than the Department of Defense? And so the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Human Services can do it for research and development, but they cannot do it for prototypes. And prototypes is what they used for the COVID vaccines. We can get back to that. Then we have the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation. All of these are just ways for these agencies to get things, to acquire things without a lot of red tape, is how they describe it. And the Department of Health and Human Services can do research and development OTA. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but they cannot do prototypes. So they cannot commission or acquire any actual thing. They can pay for research, but they can't actually buy something that's a prototype. And permanent authority, I don't know how that applies, but apparently it doesn't apply to COVID because they had to use the DoD authority for prototypes. They couldn't use their own authority because they don't have an authority for prototypes.
Yeah, an interesting question what that would actually be, this research and development, doing research and development under an OTA. I don't know, but and so they have permanent authority. Okay, NASA, by the way, NASA down here, they have prototype authority, and the DNDO, the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, as well. And
so these are all
DHS.
defense related, right? I mean, you can see how
Right.
most of this is defense related. So the Health and Human Services sticks out because it doesn't seem to be defense related.
Yes,
but it is
right.
defense related if you think about biodefense.
Right. These OTAs, which are weird in themselves, I think, because, well, it's nice to cut through red tape, but it's also dangerous, and it's not really clear to me how often that should be used or if that should be used at all.
So basically, I would call it an illegal use of OTA. They tried to challenge it. So Brook Jackson was a very brave Pfizer whistleblower. In her case, I forget which appeal it was, tried among many other strategies to say, how can you use an OTA, which is for the military, to order 100 million, 200 million, 300 million doses of something that's clearly not for the military? So how can you use that? You can't use OTA for that. That is a legal challenge, which should have been brought a million times. But that was the only time that I'm aware of that anybody actually brought that up in court. So guess what the judge said? The judge said, I cannot rule on a military decision. If the military tells me that they need an OTA for 100, 500 million doses of something, who am I? I'm just a judge. I can't rule. So basically, this is the extra constitutional, extra legal space that I'm talking about. When you start using military laws and emergency laws, then judges start not being able to rule.
Yeah,
or saying that they can't rule.
Right, right. And but in this COVID-19 contracting report, it says that HHS partnered with the Department of Defense. So it's not just the Department of Defense. It's not just the military. There is the HHS involved as well. So they partnered with the Department of Defense. So if the judge says, well, I can't do anything about the military, what about HHS? They partnered with the DoD. That's not in the where does it say that this is legal?
Well, but that's not illegal. So the word partnered is, it's a euphemism. Basically, the contracts were signed and everything went through the DoD. They say HHS partnered in order to pretend that HHS was involved. HHS was not involved. It was military.
Oh, that is very interesting. So they they worded it in a way to let it appear as something kind of benign. The HHS was asking, can I please partner with the DoD?
Exactly.
Okay. But you're saying, no, it came from the Department of Defense. Okay. So let's go. So we looked at this table, and I also wanted, so, 5 years you're right that 5 years before COVID, there was an exceptional use of OTA introduced. And I think you alluded to that before, but I just wanted to go to this page here. Let me see, 276. Here we go.
Right. So this is where they created this. Yes. So in 2015, they created this sort of extra legal pathway under OTA for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. So weapons of mass destruction, right? Countermeasures. So
Right.
Countermeasures to weapons of mass destruction, which includes bioweapons. If you're going to do that, you can have an OTA pathway to work with the Department of Defense and develop chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear medical countermeasures. Still, they have to be FDA licensed. FDA licensed means it has to go through the entire regulatory process that I described before. So you might be able to bypass the manufacturing regulations with OTA, maybe, but you still have to go through the FDA licensing. In order to get around that, you need EUA. Okay. So it's very complicated. They put in two different things. So they have two different ways of bypassing the regulation. One is OTA, but OTA still says you need FDA license. If you want to avoid that, you have to go through EUA.
Right. And so the CBRN, this refers to weapons of mass destructions, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. And so these medical countermeasure is also a military term, are measures against countering weapons of mass destruction.
Correct. So nothing to do with naturally occurring diseases.
Exactly.
Nothing.
And the date is interesting. So that was in 2015. That was the second Obama administration when this was announced, that which was the first time that the DoD opened this pathway to use the OTA, which is strictly military until then, strictly military thing, this other transaction thing, to use this very weird thing that allows you to just slash all the regulations, to push everything away. So to use this brutal method, to use this acquisition pathway, to work with DoD, for others who don't have that ability normally, to work with DoD to develop FDA licensed chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear medical countermeasures. Yeah. That is quite breathtaking.
That is, and you know who that is who develops those things? Pharmaceutical companies. So this basically creates the public-private partnership between the DoD and the pharmaceutical companies to manufacture countermeasures. So the DoD and like you said at the beginning, there's no more daylight between the military industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industrial complex. They fuse basically into one. And this is one way in which they become fused.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that made it possible, because when we looked in our previous interview together with Sasha, we looked at the contracts, and it said the DoD was contracting directly, the DoD with Pfizer, the DoD with Moderna, etc.
And that was true in every country. So the whole shenanigan that's happening with van der Leyen in the EU, and how supposedly the contracts were on her cell phone and she lost them, or some crazy thing like that. So those were military contracts. So they're just hiding the fact that the EU also had military contracts for the countermeasures.
Right.
So that's why that whole shenanigan is happening, because they don't want to reveal those contracts.
And now look at the sentence down here. The announcement went on to specify that enabling technologies can include animal models of viral, bacterial, or biological toxin disease and pathogenesis, assays, and I'm going to go to the next page, diagnostic technologies, or other platform technologies that can be applied to development of approved or licensed MCMs, medical countermeasures. So there's another, you can just see this this puzzle piece coming in place that was essential for what was done to the American population during the pandemic.
Yeah. And so, but still, like I say in the next paragraph, even this sort of carve out that they carved for medical countermeasures and OTA, it still has nothing to do with manufacturing hundreds of millions of product.
Right.
It just has nothing to do with it. And yet that's what they used it for. So I would say it was an illegal use of OTA. I wish somebody could challenge that. I haven't seen it, except like I mentioned in the Brook Jackson case. That's the only time that I've seen it challenged.
Yes, and the judge really just said, I can't go there. He didn't make any decision whether this was legal or not. He just said, I can't judge. I can't judge where it comes to the military. And then here, this was also very, very interesting, and you already alluded to it. Pfizer agreed to deliver a prototype project and a manufacturing demonstration, a large-scale vaccine manufacturing demonstration. What on earth is that, a manufacturing demonstration?
Nobody knows.
And how do you deliver that? How do you deliver? What is being delivered here? What is being delivered?
Right. So we don't know. If you really look at this and the language, like you said, the language is so completely incomprehensible and convoluted that if you actually took a legal knife to it and they tried to actually, parse it out, it's nonsense. It's legally nonsensical. And again, why nobody is I guess it's because it's military. So this is the extra legal world that we live in now. If the military has a contract, and it doesn't even matter what it's for, it might be for, something that's going to affect the entire civilian population of the world, we still can't challenge it in court because it's a military contract. So that's kind of where we are with this. And so the prototype project, the manufacturing demonstration, those are all just weird, nonsensical words that are intended to shoehorn the production of hundreds of millions of vaccines into the OTA, which does not apply to that at all. So the OTA does not apply to manufacturing hundreds of millions of vaccines, but that language is supposed to somehow, upside down and backwards, shoehorn it into the OTA.
So when you look at the sentence here from the agreement, this agreement between Pfizer and the US government, it says the intent of this prototype is to demonstrate that Pfizer has the business and logistics capability to manufacture 100 million doses of its currently unapproved mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccine for the government. So that's the intent, to demonstrate. I don't even know how you can possibly demonstrate that you have this business and logistics capability. How do you do that without actually doing it? I mean, maybe you can say, okay, I have these facilities where we can produce them, but it says here, black and white, that the intent is only, exclusively from what this says here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it says the intent is to demonstrate. It doesn't say that intent is to have Pfizer manufacture these 100 million doses.
Well, but that's right. It doesn't, but it is implied, like you said, it's implied because how do you demonstrate without manufacturing?
But then why do they write it then? I was just really wondering who manufactured it then. If Pfizer's job is only to demonstrate that they can do it, but not to actually do it, why write it in such a weird way?
In order to shoehorn into the OTA something that is illegally not an OTA agreement. It's not a legal OTA agreement, but they have to make it legal by saying we're not actually asking you to manufacture this. We're asking you to demonstrate that you can manufacture it. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to buy all the stuff that you manufacture as you're demonstrating that you can manufacture it. You're asking the question as if they were earnestly saying something that they meant. They don't mean anything that they're saying here. What they mean is, we want to use OTA, so we're going to use some convoluted language that doesn't mean anything. It's gobbledygook in order to be able to use OTA to buy hundreds of millions of vaccines through OTA so that we have no good manufacturing practice oversight, and then we're going to give it to the whole civilian population. That's what they're saying. But they can't say that because that would be illegal.
Yeah. It's interesting. I went back to the sentence here in 2015 where they make this this where they add this exception or this additional acquisition pathway. What they say there is work with DoD to develop FDA licensed chemical, et cetera, medical countermeasures to develop them.
Right.
I don't know. It doesn't say manufacture them. Maybe
No, it
that's
doesn't.
why
Thank you.
maybe that's why they worded it in this obscure
Exactly,
way.
Cornelia. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yep.
Wow.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, okay. All right. So let's
So I even say nowhere in the history of other transaction agreements is there anything remotely resembling the conflation of a prototype. So they said, we're paying you for a prototype. This is prototype project, right?
yes. Yes.
So it's a
Yeah.
prototype and you're conflating it with the manufacturing of hundreds of millions of things. How is that a prototype? And how is that a demonstration? Just like you said.
Yeah, right. So now let's go to the FDA licensure. So they still needed that. They had this OTA pathway, and now this requires, and you're right, only FDA licensure.
Right. So if you had OTA and you wanted to manufacture those 100 million or more than hundreds of millions, because they said, we're going to get lots more. Once you demonstrate this, we're going to get lots more from you. You still have to get FDA licensure, right? Normally, FDA licensure means you have to go through clinical development, takes years. You have to show that it's safe and effective. It takes a really long time. So how do you do that without going through all of those steps? You use emergency use authorization. And that's step 2. So OTA is step 1 for you get those contracts. And step 2 is you use EUA in order to make these products without any regulation at all.
Okay. So you need the OTA to just to develop to manufacture these shots, and then you need the EUA to get them into people.
To get them approved. So basically they go together. Approved. So I mean, these processes are happening at the same time because of course they shortened the development process to 0 and they started manufacturing it more or less at the same time that they were doing their clinical trials. So it was all happening simultaneously. But yes, you need both the OTA and the EUA.
Yes. And the clinical trials happened at the same time because they were completely worthless and had meaningless. Were just kind of show trials. It was a show trial. It was a clinical show trial. Yes.
Good one. Yes, that's good.
Yeah, right. Okay. So let's go into these EUAs. Because EUAs, everybody knows that. I think everybody now knows this acronym EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. But what's really behind it? Wow, that really blew my mind.
I can tell you, and you asked before how long it took. I think it took me a month just to understand EUA and do all the research on where it came from and what it means. That's how hard it is. The laws that we have, I mean, our legal system, I don't even know how it can function because it's impossible to understand the laws. And this particular law is written specifically in order to make it as convoluted and incomprehensible as possible. So it's very, very hard to understand.
Yeah. Wow. And then not only have you this convoluted law, then you also have access like OTA. You take the axe and you hack it all up and do whatever you want. And all of a sudden you are in some sort of legal lawless space.
That's right.
You have other authority. Oh, I have other authority to overrule everything else. Give me some other authority. All right. So EUA.
So EUA, it starts with.
I like that what you did in your book. You first say, let's understand first what it is not. What is EUA not?
Yes, and that's the most important thing.
Where is it?
So that probably is the most important table, and that's the table that Catherine Watt found in a CDC presentation. This is the table they don't want you to see. And
Yes,
this
exactly.
table shows legally, according to the regulatory agencies, what EUA means compared to other ways of authorizing or approving medical products or pharmaceutical products. So this chart shows you that EUA is an extra regulatory process. And the reason it's an extra regulatory process is because it's not supposed to apply to anything at all that has to do with regular pharmaceuticals for the population. It's supposed to have to do with, weapons of mass destruction and, bioweapons attacks and biowarfare. That's what it's supposed to apply to. And so, what is it not? What does it not give us? Okay, so EUA it's not likely to tell us if something is effective. It's not likely to tell us if something is safe. Safety signals might be identified, but it's not likely to tell us. It's not likely to give us any information that can be used on future patients, meaning once you give it during the emergency, you don't have any information about anything for future use. Generally, there's no data collection. So I want people to look at this very, very carefully. Retrospective studies may be conducted and published. This means that any kind of study that was done was not required by law. They don't need to do, it's not likely. They're not going to systematically collect data on side effects, and they're not going to systematically collect data on effectiveness, because again, EUA is intended for really dire emergency situations when you don't have time to do any of those things. So it also does not require any kind of adverse event, anything. So the contracts with Pfizer required them to report adverse event that were reported to Pfizer, deaths and serious adverse events. They had to report them to the FDA. So they have reports that we know with lots of deaths and lots of injuries. Once they report them to the FDA, that's the end of the legal requirement. Nobody's required to do anything. The FDA is not required to do anything. The CDC is not required to do anything. Nobody is required legally to do anything. And so when people say the CDC needs to be reformed because they didn't do anything about all these adverse events in VAERS, which is the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or the FDA needs to be reformed because they didn't oversee appropriately the clinical trials, or they didn't oversee the manufacturing, they weren't required to oversee it. So it's not the CDC or the FDA that needs to be reformed. It's these laws that need to be canceled, repealed, never used again, and challenged in court. So it is a waste of time. It is a waste of energy. It is a complete misdirection to talk about how we have to reform the CDC, the FDA, the HHS, because they're the ones who were responsible for what happened with the COVID countermeasures. The COVID countermeasures are not vaccines. As we know, they changed the definition of vaccine in order to accommodate this mRNA technology. The countermeasures are military products that are not regulated, that are authorized through military extra-legal pathways called OTA and EUA. And because of that, the FDA, the CDC, the HHS, none of them have any authority or requirement to regulate these things at all. So you can go and scream at the CDC forever and take them to court and talk about how the officials are corrupt and how they're captured by industry. All of that is true, but none of that has to do with regulating these products. These products have no legal requirements for them to do anything. So I'm begging you, everybody, please, when you talk about what we can do to prevent this from happening again and to get these products off the market, the only way we can do that is by challenging the legal framework in which they were approved. If we don't challenge the legal framework and we start talking about, reforming the CDC and reforming the FDA and putting on trial, the officials who were in charge of these approvals, that is not actually getting at the problem. The problem is that we were operating in an extra legal, extra constitutional framework of OTA and EUA and the PrEP Act. And if we don't address that, then we're actually not addressing the problem at all. So EUA does not require any data collection. That means adverse events, deaths, no requirement at all.
Exactly. So, the EUA, this emergency use authorization that was only introduced in 2000 and when was it? 2004, I believe. This needs to be repealed. This has to go. And, if you look at this table and if you study it and if you understand it, anybody who looks at this and understands it, nobody rather who looks at it and understands it would ever have gotten these shots. Nobody.
Precisely.
And to withhold this, so you said that Catherine Watt found this table somewhere after doing, and she is an absolutely meticulous researcher. Amazing woman. So she found this doing the sleuth work of digging into documents. And so if this of course should have been, if you do something like that, if you use something like this EUA, then of course you should tell the honest thing and the right thing, and the non-criminal thing would have been to tell people, and then nobody would have gotten the shot. So,
that's right.
And if you look at this, it's a really nice chart because it lets you compare what happens in a clinical trial, what happens with expanded access, which is this compassionate use. If somebody, I guess, is very, very sick and wants to try something and doesn't really care about the risk because they're going to die anyway. If you compare this, look at, for example, what I thought was stunning. Look at the sizes here. So this is a clinical trial. Really, there are all sorts of stringent regulations for a clinical trial. And then it says how many people are affected here. But they call that level of access to investigational product. Depends on trial design. So like 20 to 100, several hundred, 300 to 3,000. Very few people. When you go to expanded access, it's even fewer. It's maybe it's just one patient, individual patient, or maybe it's 100, maybe it's 1,000. But now look at this here in the right corner. Can enable. So the EUA, that is not likely to be effective. Not likely to be effective. I mean, let that sink in. Not likely.
Well, it's not likely to give us info. So again, let's be specific. It's not likely to give us information. We don't know. It's not likely to be.
Okay.
We can't know. We can't know if it's effective. We can't know if it's safe. It's not likely to give us any information about whether it's safe or effective.
Okay. So if it has no ability to inform effectiveness, it's basically Russian roulette.
Right.
We don't know. It could be effective. It could not be effective. Right. It could be safe. It could not be safe. We don't know. We don't know. Great. And then ability to obtain useful information, not likely. So what is this? What is this horrible thing? What's the use of it anyway? You ask yourself, why would anybody ever take something so useless? Availability of findings doesn't exist. They don't collect data. So you can't even say anything. You will never be able to say whether it's effective or safe because we don't collect data. Did everybody die? Well, maybe, but we didn't collect data, so we don't know. Informed consent required? No reform consent required. Oh yeah, right? We were all no informed consent required. Institutional review board required? No, nobody is reviewing anything. It's just happening. And then this is just can enable access to a large number of patients. Yeah, for sure. Like 2/3 of the American population, like hundreds of millions. For something that we don't know anything about safety nor effectiveness, nor are we interested in finding out, nor are we interested in reviewing anything. This is just, I was shocked.
It is shocking.
I had no idea that this is what an EUA is.
Yeah, it's shocking. People think EUA is EAU. EAU, which is expanded access use, that's that second column. So people confuse it and they think that it's the, compassionate use thing. So some people think that. Some people just think, oh, well, it's emergency. I don't think they have any idea. They think, well, we still do clinical trials and we still gather all the information. So that's what we just went through. So it's not likely to generate information about effectiveness. It's not designed to provide evidence about safety. Okay, this is extremely important. Okay, this is extremely important. This is what the 2009 Institute of Medicine of the National Academies, this is also, I think Catherine Watt found this also. And it's talking about what is EUA, how do we use EUA? And they said,
Debbie, read the statement for those who don't watch, but just listen.
Yeah, it is important to recognize that an EUA is not part of the development pathway. It is an entirely separate entity that is used only during emergency situations and is not part of the drug approval process. Not part of the drug approval process. That means that anything that gets emergency use authorization has not gone through the drug approval process. That means it has not gone through, like we said, any kind of rigorous testing of effectiveness, of safety, of data gathering, of the IRB is actually the board that ensures that patients are treated ethically. So it doesn't go through any of that. And this is an extremely important statement because not only are the EUA products that were first put on the market not part of the drug approval process, but what happened was they took those and they said, oh, we're going to get full FDA approval for these products, but we're not going to do it by going through the approval process. We're just going to have some hearings at the FDA where we talk about who knows what, and then we're going to say, oh, okay, now these EUA products are approved, fully approved by the FDA, even though they did not go through the legal drug approval process. So no EUA product, no mRNA product that is on the market now for anything and ever will be, unless it goes through and from the beginning, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, if it doesn't do that, and if the manufacturing does not go through good manufacturing practices, none of them are actually went through the approval process or the regulatory process.
Yes, and that also wasn't clear to people. And these clinical show trials that were done by Pfizer and Moderna, they really gave the impression that there was some sort of clinical trial going on. This is how most people thought about it, don't you think?
Well, they did have something going on that they called a clinical trial. They had patients, they had arms, they gave certain patients certain things. Of course, they didn't report who died and who didn't, and they didn't report accurately. And the whistleblower, the whistleblowers like Brook Jackson, who tried to say, wait a minute, there's nothing here that is actually a clinical trial. Like, everything is wrong. They're unblinding, so it's supposed to be a blind, so you don't know who's getting what. They're unblinding. They're not registering patients correctly. They're not reporting events correctly. Like, nothing is being done according to the way studies are supposed to be done. And then they fired her when she reported it.
Exactly. It's a funny thing. It's a funny thing with show trials, isn't it? Because if I think back about this, the Stalin's show trials, I mean, it was clear that it was a show trial. You would just, you would go in, you would venture in there and sit down and listen, and you would realize that something very strange is going on, that this is not a normal trial. And that's what they did with these clinical show trials. They didn't even bother to follow the most rudimentary rules, so that someone like Brook Jackson, she was only working for this clinical trial for a couple of days, like 10 days, 13 days, something like that. And she saw so much wrong with it that it didn't take her any time, because the most basic things were being violated in these.
That's an interesting comparison.
It wasn't a proper trial. It was immediately evident to her that it wasn't. And when she, if you had pointed out during the Stalin show trials, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is there no real attorney for the defendant, or why is the prosecutor? You would have been immediately put into the gulag, or
right, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. The problem is that the problem is that I think in the Soviet situation, it was clear to the public that they were show trials. And here it was not clear to the public that it was a show trial. I think that's
a
the
very
big
good
problem.
point. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's why Brook Jackson was so dangerous and had to be fired immediately. And I'm just amazed that there weren't more Brook Jacksons who said, "Wait a minute, this is totally wrong. I have to alert the FDA." Maybe there were more people. I don't know. Yeah, very good point. Okay, so let's go to the next page, because this is quite interesting here. You write how important it is that these EUA powers were granted in 2004 under very specific circumstances related to preparedness for attacks by weapons of mass destruction, otherwise known as CBRN agents.
Yes. So again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but this is the one takeaway that I think needs to happen with my book. This is why it's The Deep State Goes Viral, because we are in a deep state legal framework. That means that we are extra constitutional, extra legal. And it means that all the laws that are being used during COVID are laws that apply to war and terrorism. They are not laws that apply to public health, medicine, science, anything like that. They are laws in the books. If you look at like the pathway, it's interesting when you start looking at US law. It's like laws that apply to health, laws that apply to the military, laws that apply to, they have big categories, and then it breaks down more and more and more until you get, it's like a tree that breaks down until you get to the specific law. The laws that were used for COVID start with the military. And EUA is a military anti-terror, CBRN law. Therefore, it applies to situations of war and terrorism. And in situations of war and terrorism, we suspend a lot of the regulations, the oversight, and the legal protections that we have during times of peace. As we all know, when there's an emergency situation, we have martial law, perhaps. We just let the military tell us what to do because they're protecting us from an existential threat. So EUA is supposed to apply when there is an existential threat, when you need to get countermeasures very quickly to the location where there was a biowarfare or bioterrorism attack. That's it. That's the only thing it's supposed to be used for. It has nothing to do with pandemics. It has nothing to do with natural disease. The law is supposed to apply, and it says the record indicates, this is somebody who did an article about it. The record indicates that Congress was focused on the threat of bioterror specifically, not on preparing for a naturally occurring pandemic. So this was a law that was for bioterror only. And the letter of the law, in the wording of the law, it only mentions CBRN. It does not mention naturally occurring virus, pathogens or pandemics or anything like that.
Yes, and of course, SARS-CoV-2 is not a naturally occurring virus. It's not. It's the result of gain of function, or of what they call gain of function research. So it is one of these. It is a case where the EUA powers were meant to kick in, right?
So that is a very, very important and unanswered question. So if they told us that it was a naturally occurring virus, then EUA did not apply. So it was illegal. If they were telling us that, but they were treating it as if it was a bioweapon, they were lying to us. And they were not telling us that it was a bioweapon, but they were treating it as a bioweapon with these laws and within this legal framework. Now, my point to you would be, even if it was manufactured in a biolab and that they thought that it was a bioweapon, the only way that I think it would have been legal for them to use EUA is if they said to the public, okay, we're under attack by a bioweapon. Now we're going to activate these biowarfare laws. And you should know that in this state of war against this bioweapon, none of the regulations apply, none of the processes apply. They could do that.
Yes, and they would have exactly, and they would have shown the chart that we just looked at. They would have said, "Look, this is so grim. We have this terrible attack. It's a bioweapon. This virus that's going to kill everyone. Because of that, this is what happened. And now, if you want to, you can take this potentially deadly toxic thing and have it injected into you, but be aware that we don't know if it's going to be safe, we don't know if it's going to be effective, and all these things. That didn't happen. On the contrary, they constantly talked about that it was from the wet market. The entire hypothesis of lab escape was suppressed for a long time, so they didn't want anyone to think that it was a bioweapon.
But think about that, Cornelia. So they were running two parallel scams. The first scam was they were telling us that it was a naturally occurring virus, right? The second scam was that even though they were telling us that, they were applying the laws that apply to biowarfare without telling us.
Exactly.
And so what I like to say, I think I've said this in an interview before, is it doesn't matter what the virus was. It doesn't matter if it was naturally occurring or if it was a bioweapon, because the response that they used was the response to a bioweapon, which is an extra legal, extra constitutional legal framework. So whatever that virus was, I am very marginally interested in that. I'm much more interested in the fact that the biowarfare industrial complex wants all of society to operate in an extra constitutional legal framework so that they can manufacture, develop, and inject these products into the entire population, not just of the country, but of the world, repeatedly, forever. So we have to understand that when we talk about the origin of the virus, we are distracting ourselves from talking about the fact that this framework is the framework that we are operating under right now. This EUA framework, when they talk about H1N1, when they start scaring us about whatever the next thing is, when they start killing the chickens, all of those things are happening under this framework. This is the extra legal, extra constitutional framework that was put in place, that was pretty much, that was kind of brought out into the open during COVID. And now that's what they want us to operate under. And that's what we need to be talking about. We don't need to be talking too much about the virus. Okay, it was manufactured in a lab, fine. It doesn't matter, even if it hadn't been manufactured in a lab, even if it was just a naturally occurring virus, they still used the framework that applies only to bioterror and biowarfare. And they want that to be the framework. And that's the framework that we are operating under. So I implore people all the time to please not focus too much on the origin of the virus. It's fine. We can talk about gain of function and we can try to stop gain of function research, which we're not going to be able to because it is controlled by the DoD and the CIA and the Biodefense Network. It is not controlled by HHS. It is not controlled by NIH. They do not control it. They do not fund it. They do not oversee it. They have no oversight over gain of function research. Therefore, unless we understand that both gain of function research and the legal framework that was used to respond to it are all in the realm of emergency, war, biowarfare, and bioterrorism, unless we understand that, if we continue to address these issues as if they are in the realm of public health, as if they are regulated by the public health agencies, we just saw that it's not regulated by the FDA. It's not regulated by the manufacturing is not HHS. The approval and development are not FDA. It's all through the military. Yes. That's the only thing.
Yeah, right. So in a way, what do you think about this? In a way, there are kind of two narratives. There's the bioweapon narrative that was, I think, used for, like, let's say, people like President Trump and other high officials. They were told this is actually, we are not going to scare the population, but you should know that it is a bioweapon. And if you don't go along with all these illegal things, then it's on you if 20 million or 30 million, 100 million people die, right?
Yes.
And then for the civilian population, they had the pandemic narrative, so that they would, and they kept all this other stuff hidden, so they would go along with the second, with the kind of the second and much more powerful and destructive bioweapon, namely the mRNA shots, which might have been the end goal all along. I mean, that's the only thing that makes sense in my opinion. And to hide this with absolute brutality through censorship and canceling in the most brutal way imaginable, and with a really totalitarian approach. So these two things were running simultaneously, and I think there were very few people. Who understood what was being played here, and so. If you buy if you think it's a bioweapon, and it might very well have been, then it makes sense for the military to take over, and it makes sense for the National Security Council to take charge. But you must not tell the population. They are getting some other story fed to them.
That's right. Now, I would say, yes, you're right. If it is a bioweapon and that's how you want to treat it, then you have to tell the population that that's what you're doing. But if you are treating it as a bioweapon, but you're telling the population that it is a public health thing, then you're doing exactly what you said. You're running two parallel scams.
Right. So just to finish up here, I just want to, so there are these 3 steps for the EUA. Step 1 is declaring the CBRN emergency. And this emergency declaration is, it's totally separate. It's just an emergency declaration for the EUA to activate this EUA. And that thing can be ended or extended independently of any other emergency declaration. Debbie, is the EUA still in effect for the mRNA shots?
That's such a good question. We always talk about the PrEP Act. I'm going to look it up. I haven't looked up the EUA declaration because the PrEP Act declaration we know is still in effect until 2029. So let me get back to you on that.
Yeah, because, I suspect it is. And the reason I suspect it is because it says here further down in your book somewhere that if you end the EUA activation, then these drugs or these things, before they can be used without an EUA, they have to go through a really rigorous clinical trial. And I don't think that has happened, or has it? Because they are hardly doing any trials. They're just or maybe just on mice for a couple of days or weeks.
Right.
It doesn't. Right. It's not a proper trial at all.
No.
So get back to me on that. That would be interesting. So that's the first step. Then the second step is, and in this case, in COVID, it was the Secretary of, not Homeland Security, but the HHS. So it can be one of the 3: Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, or Secretary of HHS. Yeah, this is also interesting. Look at this here. Again, the same thing. There's a public health emergency or a significant potential for a health emergency.
Right.
Well, I mean, when is there not a significant, that might happen all the time. You could, depending on how wide you cast your net, there could almost always be a significant potential for a public health emergency. So then the next step is, let's just forward here, EUA step 2, meeting the statutory criteria. And they are interesting. Can you go through those?
Sure. So this is why this law is so impossible to understand and convoluted. They try to make it seem like there's actually some kind of law here, that any kind of oversight or regulation. So first you have to have a declaration. So the HHS secretary says there's a potential emergency or there's an emergency. Then they say there's some statutory criteria. That means some criteria that you have to meet. There has to be a serious or life-threatening disease. There has to be evidence of effectiveness. Well, what does that mean? It may be effective. That's the standard. It may be effective to prevent, diagnose, or treat the illness that can be caused by the biological agent that we're talking about. So that's the second one. It may be, and then it says in the law, the may be effective standard is a lower level of evidence than the effectiveness standard that FDA uses for product approval. So they literally state in the law that you cannot say it has the same effectiveness that it would have if it was approved by the FDA under usual approval processes, because it's a less than, it's a lower level of evidence. It's a may be effective. So when they said safe and effective, they weren't talking about safe and effective based on any kind of legal standard. That was just marketing talk, and it was a lie.
Oh yeah, these bastards were lying. But I don't see how evidence of effectiveness can ever be achieved, because we looked at the chart and it said we are not likely to have any kind of information about effectiveness. We cannot inform about it. So how can you have evidence that precludes evidence of effectiveness?
Exactly. Well, what they're saying here is, so that chart, actually, what that chart does is it takes this, the EUA law, and it translates it into what that means. So what they said in that chart is, because the effectiveness is maybe effective, it's a lower standard. When something is approved through EUA, it's not likely to give us information about effectiveness. So that chart translated the law and said to you.
Interesting. Yes,
yeah,
but
so that chart is a translation of the law.
But this is an official chart. This is an officially approved translation.
Right. But what I'm saying is,
this is not you translating it. So they translate this into, we cannot really say anything about effectiveness.
Right. So that's how they translated it.
So then how can there ever be an evidence of effectiveness? I don't think that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so next one is risk benefit. Yeah, look at this. Risk benefit analysis.
Microphone. So what it says here is that the known and potential benefits of the product outweigh the known and potential risks. So if nothing is known about the potential benefits or the risks, then the FDA commissioner just makes an evaluation based on whatever he decides or she decides. There's nothing here that says there's any standard. There's no standard. So there's no legal standard for evaluating the potential benefits or the potential risks and how to compare them. There's no standard. So basically it's anything that you want.
So it's like some lone absolute king deciding, this commissioner here. Who is this commissioner? Is that the
That's the FDA commissioner.
The FDA commissioner. So
this is all FDA. This is all FDA regulation. So the HHS secretary. The HHS.
Sorry. Yes, correct. Okay. So this lone commissioner can determine and doesn't really have to justify that whether the known and potential benefits, which he or she doesn't really know anything about, as we just learned, because they can't inform about effectiveness and safety, whether these unknown benefits outweigh the unknown harms. The whole thing is just like 3 times worse as Kafka.
Yes, exactly. It's just convoluted, more and more convoluted, saying nothing.
But also the power this guy has.
Yeah.
This person determines.
Yep.
Totally. I mean, or
based on nothing. It's not based on a clinical trial. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's not based on any information. It's based
and of course the commissioner doesn't determine it at all. He is being told by, I don't know, by who some general or who knows whom, what the risk benefit analysis is supposed to look like, and then he just parrots it. So, and then number 4 is the one thing that I knew about the EUA, which is no alternatives.
Right. The no alternatives is the reason that a lot of people think, including myself, that they had to suppress things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine so brutally. Like you said, they had to suppress them so brutally because there can't be an alternative.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know how many people died because of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Wow. And then the way they formulated, so they decided that all these statutory criteria were satisfied in the emergency use authorization.
This is how they satisfied them. So in order to satisfy those criteria, the FDA commissioner writes these things down. That's how you satisfy those criteria. So the FDA commissioner well, the HHS secretary says, I have concluded. Oh, the FDA secretary says this. He says, I've concluded that the emergency use, and by the way, this is very, very important. He says, I have concluded that the emergency use of Pfizer vaccine for the prevention of COVID-19. Now, that means that the only thing the vaccines were authorized for, it's also the only thing that they were contracted for between the military and Pfizer, was a product to prevent COVID-19. It wasn't to lower the severity of the symptoms. It wasn't to lower the chance of death. It wasn't to prevent long COVID. It wasn't anything except the prevention of COVID-19. Therefore, once it was clear that it didn't prevent COVID-19, that product was a failed product. It didn't do what it was contracted to do. It also didn't do what it was authorized to do. So anything else that they claim, that it lowers the severity of the symptoms, that it lowers the deaths, all of that is fantasy. It's just fabricated based on all kinds of fabricated, retrospective, observational, made up studies that have. But that's not what it was supposed to do. So basically, if they say that it does all those things, then it's doing all those things without ever having been contracted to do them, or authorized to do them, or designed to do them. It was designed to prevent COVID-19, and it doesn't prevent COVID-19. End of story. It's a failed product. So if it's even without any of what we're talking about, Cornelia, even without any of this whole authorization boondoggle, any of the extra constitutional stuff, even if we're just talking about the market, the product doesn't do what it was contracted to do. It's a failed product. So the fact that they're now testing it on 100 million other things, when it failed to do the first thing that it was supposed to do, it failed completely.
Yes. And even before it was clear that it was a failed product, this whole thing is totally absurd, because you cannot conclude that the emergency use of these shots for the prevention of COVID-19. I mean, he doesn't say it will work. He doesn't say that. He just says the emergency use for the prevention of COVID-19 meets the criteria for issuance. But as we just saw, it is impossible to make any statement about whether it meets these criteria, because it's in the character of the EUA that you cannot judge the criteria that they are asking for. So the whole thing is absurd. It's nonsensical.
Yep, it's nonsensical. It is,
and this is what all this is built on.
Yep,
it's just built on sand.
Word salad, effectiveness, safety, word salad, authorized, word salad. So they throw in these words: statutory, word salad, approval, word salad. Word salad.
And it's like in the title of this book about vaccines, turtles all the way
down.
I
was just going to say that. It's just like turtles all the way down.
Yeah. And you make this here on this page here. You talk about fraudulent claims. Make your case. Why is this?
Well,
why?
So fraud doesn't apply to these things, unfortunately. That's why all of the lawsuits have failed, because fraud doesn't apply when these extra legal frameworks are applied. There's no fraud, because anything that you do or say that about these products is protected by the PrEP Act, and safety and effectiveness don't have to be shown, as we just discussed. So there's really no way to have fraud. But what I was saying was, if they said safe and effective in any context other than preventing COVID-19. So basically, if people were told they had to take the vaccine, but it was already known that the vaccine could not prevent COVID-19, what were the grounds, even under EUA, on which they were being told that this vaccine was safe and effective, right? I mean, so they're being told it's safe and effective for something, but not to prevent COVID-19. The only legal approval is to prevent COVID-19. So I believe if I were a lawyer, I would be looking at all of these angles, and I would be looking at, can they say it's safe and effective, not fraudulent about it being safe and effective, because we can't prove that, but can they even make that false claim about anything other than preventing COVID-19? So once it was clear that it wasn't preventing it, could they even say that anymore, since that's not even part of the EUA? How could it be safe and effective at doing something other than preventing COVID-19 if it doesn't prevent COVID-19? So then when they were telling people that they had to take it and that it was safe and effective, at that point, maybe legally we can say, well, that doesn't fall within the EUA to say it's safe and effective at lowering your chance of death. It's safe and effective at lowering your chance of long COVID. That's not in here. That's not in here.
Right. So, but even, I mean, they could never say it was safe and effective based on the EUA itself, because the EUA says clearly that they cannot make any informed, they just have no knowledge about whether it's safe and effective.
Right, but that's within the statute. So the statute says you don't have to do that. So when they said safe and effective, and everybody's trying to say they were fraudulent when they said that, they weren't fraudulent because they're allowed to do that within the statute. But they're allowed to do that only, I think, but this is a legal theory.
Only when they tell people, only when they tell people that this is so. They cannot tell people it's safe and effective if they have no clue whether it's safe and effective.
Well, they can based on this and the PrEP Act. So based on the PrEP Act, they can say anything they want about it, and they can't be held accountable.
So I was wondering, so there's the PrEP Act that comes into play, but can't people sue the FDA for its unwarranted EUA declaration?
There you go. So can anybody challenge the emergency declaration that is made by the HHS secretary? For the PrEP Act, we already know that you can't, because the PrEP Act explicitly states there's no judicial review. So you can't sue for that emergency declaration. Can you sue for this emergency declaration? And like that would be like saying, well, there is no emergency, so you're not allowed to do that. I mean, it doesn't specifically stay in the statute that there's no judicial review of the emergency declaration. So, I mean, if a court wanted to say, oh, well, the FDA commissioner was wrong when he said that there was an emergency, right? Maybe. Nobody's ever challenged that.
Right. Well, they had the gall to tell people it was safe and effective when nobody had any clue, and their own EUA, their own EUA framework makes that completely clear. Mm-hmm. And then they had the gall to tell people that they never said that it would stop the transmission of COVID.
That's what I keep screaming about. Like when they say that, Deborah Birx has said that, probably Fauci. I don't have a particular instance in which he said that, but I'm sure he has. When they say that, that is completely false, because the actual contracts and the actual EUA law say prevent COVID-19. So
exactly.
There's no way that you can say that they didn't say that.
Yeah, because that's the only thing, as you pointed out, that's the only thing. They only talk about preventing COVID-19, nothing else.
Nothing else.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thanks for all your detailed questions. It's very good, because I think it's hard for people just look at the chart and understand what it says, and, reading all these. I know, because it took me a month to actually read through this stuff and understand it. So it helps to have somebody talking about it in order to help people walk through it. So I really appreciate that.
So 6 years ago, let's say 6 years ago, there were lots of things that you didn't know, right? Now, 6 years later, how many things do you think are there that you don't know?
Well, now I know the extent of how much I don't know. I don't know. I think I know the extent that I don't know anything, because, well, I actually feel like I know more in terms of knowing what I don't know. So I think many things have moved from the category of don't know, I don't know to no, I don't know, you know, because there's those different categories. So I think there's fewer things that I don't know, and there's more things that I know I don't know. So I know that everything is classified, everything is secret, and everything is pretty much run by these, you know, secret processes that are not open to the public.
You know what we witnessed over the last five and a half years, and it's probably more over the last decades, or maybe it's even over the last half century. Is this the end of the Enlightenment? I mean, is this what's happening here? Is this not just COVID, but also the whole climate extremism, climate alarmism? Is this some kind of an onset of a new age, a new dark age of pseudoscientism?
So we need many hours to discuss that, Cornelia. I think that the Enlightenment has reached a crisis. And I think that all of Western societies that were built on those ideas are in a crisis. And I think that we are reaching that point of crisis when there's a huge upheaval and kind of destruction of structures and creation of other structures. And what's being created right now, I think, is a global kind of techno-feudalist system. So a global system in which, like, there's no more national sovereignty. So during COVID, there was no national sovereignty. The countries didn't operate as countries. They operated as just arms of this global public-private partnership. And that's how I think things are being structured right now. And I think that the way the people on the top of this system are the people, the oligarchs and the companies, and the some of the politicians who have lots of money and power, who are going to try to hold on to that. And they're going to try to hold on to that by controlling the population through lots of surveillance, like we had during COVID, lots of emergencies, like you said, with the climate, with pandemics, with probably other things. And so I think that the Enlightenment ideals are certainly no longer represented by our governmental and legal systems. So I would say our governmental and legal systems are in a state of complete collapse when it comes to Enlightenment ideals, which is why I keep talking about this extra legal, extra constitutional world that we live in, and that COVID really helped to usher in and get people acclimated. People got acclimated. They got used to it. They're like, oh yeah, we have one, if one of us is sick, we're all sick, or whatever those slogans were. You know, if one, nobody's safe till everybody's safe, that kind of thing. That is the opposite of Enlightenment. And that is like a top-down totalitarian kind of system.
So the 20th century was a pretty terrible century. It was the century of intentional mass killings. I mean, not only, but that was a terrible part of it. And most of them were done by tyrannical, psychopathic rulers against their own population. Not all of them, but most of them. And the number of citizens killed by their own governments, it's estimated to be something like between 100 million and 160 million. The estimates actually keep going up with more historical research that is being done. So I'm asking myself, what's in store for the 21st century? And does COVID-19 give us a glimpse of what is ahead? So what I mean is, could the 21st century be the century of even greater mass killings that are accomplished in a much more sophisticated way, in a much more invisible way, that is hard to prove, that is hard to even grasp? That's something that actually keeps me up at night.
Me too. Absolutely. I mean, I think that this global techno-feudalist system that's kind of coming into visibility is exactly that. So whereas the killing of one's own citizens happened in the 20th century in nation states, it also happens when there are wars, like the Ukraine-Russia war, where it's really has nothing to do with anything except the military-industrial complex just wants to keep fueling itself. And so lots of people are going to get killed in the process. So that happened with nation states, and now it's just happening with the global population. But the same thing is happening. I think that's a really good parallel that you're making right there.
What's next for you? What are you going to investigate next?
So the global techno-feudalist system. So my question now, I'm going to tell you the question that I think is the question that arises from my book and from my research is this: is NATO the mercenary army of a global techno-feudalist crime cartel? How do you like that? That's complicated.
That sounds very interesting. Quite intriguing.
Yeah.
Because, especially with NATO, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that should have triggered a rethinking about the purpose of NATO, because NATO was clearly a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union and against the threat of this totalitarian empire. And when it collapsed, there should have been, or I expected a rethink, just take stock. So we are in a totally new world now. What does NATO actually mean? What should it, does it need to be reformed? Do we still need it? Do we need something else? And that never happened, which is, and there are all sorts of reasons for it, I think, that never happened. So very interesting. I'm looking forward to your next book about it.
Thanks. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Show again your book, and I hope
it's available on Amazon in all formats. It soon will be available on other platforms because some people don't like Amazon, but I encourage people to buy it on Amazon because that helps with the rankings.
Okay.
So it goes viral, and it's also a very good, I think, way to start. I've been using it myself to start conversations with people who weren't ready to talk about COVID before. And it's not political. It doesn't blame one party or one president or anything like that. It really talks about processes, laws, kind of frameworks. It talks about things that I think some people are more able to relate to. So
I know I can testify to that. It's like a very calm book, although the things that you write about are absolutely hair-raising, but it's written in a really scientific way, like a research paper. It's written like a research paper, and nonetheless, it's very engaging. I really enjoyed it. Really captured I loved reading it. So it's very scientific in this age of pseudoscientism, and I love that. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Thanks, Cornelia. I appreciate it.